Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to another Adobe XD Masterclass. My name is Howard Pinsky, Senior XD Evangelist here at Adobe, and I hope you're all doing well on this Friday afternoon, which is also April Fool's Day, one of the worst days of the year. I'm sure many of you have gotten emails and seen tweets and things like that. Just the worst. But if you are tuning in live here on Behance today, let me know in the chat I was just reading Megan's tweet about the Maple Leafs win last night. Thank you. Austin Matthews, 50th goal. Very good. Anyways, if you are tuning in live, let me know in the chat who you are and where you're tuning in from. We've got Andres and Megan, Oliver, and Brett, Drew, Laura, Wade, Stroofy, and Nabil. Great to see all of you. As possibly Nabil was mentioning, he says he misses me, but might have been because last week we did not have a masterclass. We had our week off to recharge and spend time, do things, I don't know, whatever we do on days off. Good for the mental health though. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and hop over to my screen, and if I hop over to Twitter for a second, I posted this last week. I was exploring a different kind of feel for what Behance could look like if it was a little bit more neon and slightly rearranged. So I put this together and we're going to design that today. Some of you wanted to know how this was done, and it's fairly simple for the most part. A few buttons, some images, a lot of images, and some text, but we're going to go through all that in today's masterclass. So let's go ahead and hop over to Adobe XD. And we're gonna get going. Let's see, I saw some April Fools. I had one whole April Fool's notification which I looked at, tuffed, and deleted. I agree, yeah, they're just not that enjoyable anymore. Maybe it's just because everything's going on in the world and, you know, it's hard to laugh at things, or they're just not funny. Could be that. Anyways, so we're in Adobe XD and we're gonna start, since this is a web-based project, I'm going to start with a 1920 by 1080 pixel artboard. Of course, if you want to design smaller, you can do that. Or for other platforms, iPhone, tablet, Instagram story, whatever it might be. Alrighty, let's go ahead and begin. So we've got our artboard here. I'm going to go ahead and name this Home. Now, in this particular version that I designed, it's on the darker side. So it's that dark mode. I was thinking about making a dark mode joke during on Twitter today, but I don't know, right? The joke was, if anyone was wondering, it was essentially going to be, because XD doesn't have dark mode, a little bit of context, but it was going to be around the fact, like, here's a way to activate dark mode in Adobe XD. Go to Adobe Fonts and look up the typeface dark mode. Ha ha ha. That's all I've got. All right. Just not funny. So again, dark website. So what we're gonna do is, I'm just the worst. I'm going to set the background color very dark. I'm not gonna go pure black, but I'm gonna bring it up just a little bit so it's slightly not as dark. Very technical, right? You're all finally seeing the very bad dark mode joke in chat. There's like a 15-second delay. Yeah, Drew says the chaos that would have followed. That's part of the reason why I also didn't do it. I just don't want to deal. I already get enough tweets about dark mode in XD, or the lack of dark mode. I don't want to wake the beasts. So I'll let you all in on the little secret. That's about it. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to start laying out the various elements that are part of this landing page, right? Now at the top we have our navigation bar, and we're going to keep things fairly simple right now. We're just going to block things in, and then we're going to start adding that magical content, right? Now for a navigation bar, there's no magical number in terms of the height of it. Obviously you don't want to do something like this, especially if it's going to be a sticky header, which is going to be fixed at the top. You don't want to make it too large, but you also want to make it large enough that you can fit certain elements. And in this case, we're going to be putting a button to share your work. We're obviously going to be putting like a notification bell, a logo, and a search bar. So if you have a navigation bar that is too thin, then it's going to be very difficult to put that search bar up there. So somewhere in this range here looks pretty good for now, but once we start adding in some additional content, we may need to tweak. Now, down below, right about here, I want to put a nice, full width image. It's not going to be full height, but it's going to be full width. And what could be interesting about this is right now on Behance, you obviously have your nice gallery view, and you have a banner at the top, right? There's something like this. There's a banner right at the top of a user profile, but there isn't really a nice large full width, project. So I'm thinking you might be able to click into this directly from this nice banner, and this you can change this. Maybe it could be a carousel or so on and so forth. So we'll start it somewhere about this size, and then to consolidate some of the information a little bit. And we're going to run into some challenges with a design like this, and I'll talk about that later. But to consolidate some of the information, we may want right in this area here to maybe put the user profile, or at least the user avatar. So I'll draw out an ellipse somewhere in this range here. I can either have the horizontal centers snap, as you can see right in this area, or to save a little bit more space, I'll move it up a touch, right? All right. And then inside of this particular featured image, we're going to have some text. The title, how many likes, how many appreciations, views, that sort of thing. And then maybe a little bit of secondary information when it was published, for example, right? So again, we're blocking things out, so nothing's going to be too exciting right now. Title of project will be right over here. And then below this, maybe we'll have the date and maybe the application that was used. We'll make this quite a bit smaller, and we'll pop it about there for now. And then we're going to get back to adding some additional content in this area shortly as well. All right, and then down below, we will get to some additional information here, but down below we may want to start that project gallery. So you might have various thumbnails going across and then down the page. So let's start off. We can also drag some guides out to help line things up. Maybe 88 on this side, and we'll do the same thing on the other. Right about there. All right, so we'll grab our good old rectangle and we'll draw out our first thumbnail. Now, we want to make sure in this particular row that 3 projects can fit really nicely across this page. So I show this tip, it's not so much of a tip, but I show this a lot in my master classes. We could estimate it, 1, 2, and then 3. It's a little bit too wide or too thin, so maybe make it a bit bigger. And boop, and that's not too bad, right? But what we can also do is stretch this first container all the way across the artboard, and then within the properties inspector, right over here to the right, we can do some basic math. So the width divided by 3, which is how many of these projects we want in this row, right? And then we can minus, let's say 8, right? So that we can have a nice amount of padding in between each one. And then if we go ahead and space these out, looks pretty good. And if you wanted more padding, of course, you can adjust that, or you can use a repeat grid. So we have one of our containers selected, and I'm going to press the repeat grid button right here at the top right-hand corner. Whoop, whoop. And now I can drag out 2 more like this. And then I can move my mouse in between any of them. Let me zoom in a touch and adjust the spacing. And what's nice about using a repeat grid is all of these cells are in sync. So if I make one of them a little bit thinner or wider, it's going to push those changes to all the other ones as well. So if I wanted a little bit more space, but I think this could look pretty nice. And maybe I'll round out the corners. Let's try about 16. All right. Now, we obviously want to enable scrolling on this particular landing page, right? We want to be able to launch the preview, see what's above the fold, and then we want to be able to scroll down to see the rest. So with the artboard selected at the top, I'm going to simply drag down. And what you're going to notice is over here to the left, we have our viewport handle. So everything above this is going to be visible when you launch the preview. Anything below will be visible upon scroll. And if I go ahead and do that, boop, right? It's very ugly right now, but you can kind of see what's going on. We have our landing page and we can scroll down to see whatever is below. Now, what I'm also thinking is, right down below this particular row of images, we may want maybe another featured image or project, right? So I can grab my rectangle, draw one out like this. I'll round out the corners to be consistent. And then we can maybe add one more right below, which I'll duplicate. All right, perfect. So we have our images, which we will be populating very shortly. And then let's add some additional information right up here where the user avatar is. So we might want the person's name, we might want maybe the location, or Thomas says, it's not ugly, it's progress. I agree, that's a good way of looking at it. A few buttons to follow and message, and then maybe some social media icons. So let's start off with the user's name, artist name, and we could fill in some, information. Maybe we'll put Laura. And then, it depends where you are in the project, and how you kind of handle your projects. Some people like to start defining character styles and colors right away. Some like to kind of mock things up and block things out and then start defining some of that stuff. Now, I already know, because this is a Behance project or something for Behance, not officially, but it's, around Behance, I'm probably going to be using the Adobe Clean typeface, which is an internal typeface, so you won't be able to find it readily on Adobe stock or Adobe fonts, I should say. But I believe it's what we use in many of our web-based properties. So I'll go ahead and set that. And maybe I'll bump up, because this is probably the main bit of information in this section. I may want to bump up the weight. Let's try extra bold and see what that looks like. And then down below, visual artist, Neon Industries. Perfect. And then I'm going to drop the size of this, because this is secondary information, to about 22. And I'm also going to drop the weight as well, just so we have a nice amount of emphasis on the artist's name, and then just a little bit on the actual title and industry or whatever company right over here. All right. So that is looking pretty good. And then down below, we might want two buttons, one to follow this user and then one to possibly message them. And this is kind of where components are going to start to come into play. So I'm going to draw out my first button, something in this range here, and we'll choose a nice blue, actionable blue color. Maybe I'll round out the corners completely. Let's tweak this just a little bit. There we go. And then on the inside of this button, which might be a little bit too thick right now, but we're going to see how things look in a moment. Type out message. Let's lower the size to about 18, and then maybe we'll bump this up, because this is a call to action, something that users will be clicking on, so we're going to bump this up in size a little bit. All right. Let's tweak the color of the button just a little bit more again. There we go. Okay, that could do. Now, what I want for this button is I want to make sure that not only is it grouped, but it's also turned into a component. And you don't have to group anything to turn it into a component. It just keeps things organized a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and call this button. And then over within the properties inspector, I'm going to press that plus button, or you can use the Command or Control K shortcut to create a component as well. And once this is done, a lot of people, when they create a button, they immediately go to the properties inspector and enable padding. Now, I'm not going to in this case, and I should note, actually, you know what? I'll keep that as that. I'm not going to enable padding in this case because I want both of these buttons to be the same size. So there isn't this weird, tilt to the page where one button's a lot larger than the other. Now, if you notice, if I turn padding on and I start changing the text inside of this button, it's going to automatically resize. And in many situations, that's exactly what you may want. But if you have something like a follow button, and then you have another button which says, you know, if we just put the word message, for example, it won't look too bad because it's about the same size, a little bit longer. But if you do something like message Laura, right? All of a sudden you have one button that's a lot larger than the other. And then once we create the second state, which is going to be a secondary button or an outline button, then it's going to look even stranger. And it's almost going to give a little bit more emphasis to the larger button than the one on the left, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to turn padding off. And then over within the Properties Inspector, one more time, we're going to press that plus button. And we're going to create a new state. And this is going to be our outline state. So this will help us create a secondary button. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to dive in here. I'm going to turn off the fill, activate a border, change it to white. I may want to bump up the size of that border to about 2, and then we'll type out message. And because we don't have padding turned on, that button remained the exact same size as before. And now, since we do want another button over here to the right, we can either manually drag one over there just like I did, or we can place this single button into a group. Whoops, that's hiding. Command and Control G and not H. I'm gonna call this buttons. And then over within the Properties Inspector, we can turn a stack on. Now, because there's only one element inside this group right now, it's gonna define it as a horizontal stack, which is in this case what we want, but you can always change it. So if I double click in here and duplicate, it's going to automatically take that new button and boop, pop it over to the right. And we can of course rearrange these as we need to. We can adjust the spacing, but I'm going to increase it a little bit to about 16. And then we want to make sure to switch this particular button over to the outline state. I think 16 might be too wide. It's not too bad, but might be a bit wide. Now, the nice thing about using components, kind of similar to what I showed with repeat grids earlier, is that you can make changes to one of them and it's going to push those changes to all the others. So if I wanted these buttons to be a little bit larger, what I can do is stretch them out. And you're noticing it's not just stretching out or resizing the blue button, it's also resizing the instance and the state, which is exactly what we want in this case, right? All right, that could do, and maybe I will just bring this in a little bit. Is 8 gonna be too squishy? It's not too bad. Let's run with it and we'll see what that looks like. All right, and then finally, down below, we might also want some social media icons so that you can follow this user on Twitter or any of the other platforms if you want. So we're gonna start with a good old ellipse. Let's set this at border. And then on the inside, we want our social media icons. Now, there are many ways to get these icons. One way is you can use a typeface like Font Awesome Brands. And Font Awesome has an amazing set of icons that you can load to your computer or you can have wherever. You can also use them on the web, but they also have a brands version. So you can just type out, let's say Twitter, for example, and you've got a Twitter icon, right? I'm going to group this, call this Twitter. I'm also going to place this into a larger group, very similar to the buttons. I can now turn a stack on, and then I can just duplicate a few. So let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 networks, and this one might be YouTube. Instagram, Facebook, maybe F, and then we might also want maybe Dribble. Whoa. Dribble, there we go. All right, looking fancy. I'm gonna make sure to give a little bit more room up here. Now, if you don't have a typeface that allows you to, create these icons like this. You can also go ahead and go into the plugins panel and then use the icons for design plugin, and you can just type in something like Twitter, and you can grab a bunch of different Twitter icons. They're all vector based, so you can edit the color, you can edit the path if you need to, and they should have basically all the different icons that you're going to need. All right, Andre is asking, in the case of a copy of a component within a stack, XE puts the main instance. Yeah, so I have actually asked our internal team about that. Never really got a straight answer as to why. It has bothered me quite a bit in the past. I wish I had an answer for you. It might be on the backlog of a bug to fix. If it is a bug, it might be intended. I'm not sure, but I would love to see that the instance go to the right as the second one instead of the main component. But I feel you. I feel you on that one. All right, so this is looking pretty good. Now we can start adding some content to actually make this experience look a little bit better, right? So this top section, we may want a nice featured image that kind of extends across the entire width. So if I hop over to Finder, I've got some great neon cyberpunk type of images. I'm gonna grab this one here from Adobe Stock and boop, there we go. I can double click and move it around if I need to. That looks pretty good. Now, one thing I might also want is, this navigation bar at the top. I may want to maybe allow some of the color from this image down here to bleed through, whether it's just by dropping the opacity or using a background blur. And this is very ugly right over here. I'm going to change this to white just for now, but we're going to deal with this section in just a moment. All right, so what we're going to do is, we want to, again, allow some of those colors to bleed on through. So we want to make sure that this image in the background is actually extended up to the top underneath that navigation bar. Just like that. I can resize and move this around again if I need to. And then for the actual navigation bar itself, because this is a darker version of this website, we're gonna start off by switching the fill over to black, like that. And like I mentioned, we could drop the opacity or we can activate a background blur. And I think a background blur might work best in this situation, and here's why. If we started to add some content on this navigation bar, which we're going to do towards the end, thank you, Wade, boop.com, B-O-O-O-O-P, I think there's 5 O's in there. That'll link to my YouTube videos. So if we have a bunch of information inside of this navigation bar, which we're going to do if we have time at the end, then if we simply lower the opacity, even just a little bit, right? There could be some very distracting elements behind there that would kind of block you from really seeing some of the content on top of this navigation bar, right? But if we instead use a background blur on this navigation bar, let's set the brightness at 0, set the blur amount all the way at 50, and then maybe experiment with the effect opacity down to the bottom. We can also drop the brightness a little bit as well, just like that, right? So we're still allowing some of that color to seep through, as you can see right in this area. We can also maybe drop this a touch so we have a little bit more. But now, if we do have information on top of this, it'll be a lot easier to read and digest because we don't have these harsh, sharp lines. It's a kind of a nice, whoops. It's just a nice blur right back there, right? All right. Again, we're going to get back to the navigation bar in a little bit. Now, in terms of the information over here, we want to accomplish a few things. We want to stylize this a little bit. And even though we're using Adobe Clean for the body copy throughout this experience, we could possibly get away with adding a little bit of a display header at the top. So another typeface I found recently was Wayfinder CF, which is a really interesting looking typeface that I think could work for this particular project. Now, this title may differ from project to project, and it'd be cool if there was a way when you're setting the project to define the typeface that's going to be displayed on the homepage. That'd be kind of neat. but I'm going to bump this up to about heavy. And then down below in this secondary information, this is kind of where we'll probably want to switch back to Adobe Clean, so it's a little bit easier to read, because if we do use something like Wayfinder again, and it's, you know, that small, maybe even a bit smaller, it's going to be very difficult to read, right? The title, pretty simple to read, but the secondary information, because it's smaller, it's not as easy, right? I'm going to bump this up a touch as well. So for here, we're going to go back to Adobe Clean, just like that. And then maybe I'll bump it up to bold so it's nice and legible. And what day is it? April 1st. 2022, maybe that's when it was published. And then we might want, maybe this was Photoshop and Illustrator were used, right? Superscript. Beautiful. And then down below here, we may want some, maybe how many likes, how many views, how many comments, that sort of thing, right? So we'll make this fairly quick. We'll draw out a container here and we'll type out, I don't know, that many likes possibly. We're going to pretend that there's some sort of icon inside of this container. We may get to that shortly, but I'm going to group this. I'll call this likes. Oops, not lies. Sometimes likes are lies, right? I'm going to group this as well, and stats maybe. Stack like before, and duplicate and duplicate. Now this one over here might be the views. Views are typically a little bit more than likes, so we'll do something like 12,203, right? And then comments, not a lot of people comment on things. All right, that could do. Not perfect, but it'll do. Now, what we might notice, if I go ahead and select these and move them on down, is some of this is a little bit difficult to read, right? And certainly depending on the image that we choose for this featured section, it may be even more difficult to read. So what we might want is to put a little bit of maybe an overlay back there. I may also want to make this, now that I'm looking at it, I may want to make this a little bit larger. So I'm going to group this, call this featured. Make sure to organize some of this stuff. Say nav, and then this will be our gallery. Perfect. Now what I can do is I can start kind of moving some of this stuff around. Now you're noticing responsive resize is doing a pretty good job, but because, you know, a lot of these elements inside of this group are floating, it's not doing exactly what we want. So what I'm going to do here is dive in and, you know, add some subgroups. So these elements here will be our project, and then these over here will be user, just like that. And now if I were to grab the group again, we have much better resizing, right? Now, one thing that would be really nice is when I resize this downwards to make this larger, I would love if this gallery at the bottom also moved as well. So I can actually grab both of these groups, place them into another larger group, and call this, let's say, content. And then within the properties inspector, turn another stack on. And this time it defined it as a vertical stack because the content inside of this group going top to bottom, right? But now if I dive in here and then make the featured section larger, it's going to automatically push that gallery down, which is exactly what we want, right? All right, let's move this up a little bit. That's looking pretty good. All right, so going back to what I was discussing a little bit earlier, I may want a little bit of an overlay in the background. So I'm going to select this image here. I'm going to duplicate it, Command and Control D, and then I'm going to change the color. So I'm going to get rid of the image by changing either the color or setting a gradient, which I'm going to do. And then we want somewhat of a darker gradient. So, we could go ahead and set both colors at black and then select the top color, drop it down to 0, and then experiment with the opacity, right? That could work. But we also may want the gradient to be a little bit more subtle. So maybe I might want to change this and add a little bit of color in here. Maybe I'll do the same thing for the top as well. Maybe I can make this entire container a little bit smaller like that. And then experiment a little bit more with the gradient, right? So we've added a little bit of color in there so that it doesn't look as harsh. It still also kind of blends in with the background, but if you take a look at with no overlay and then overlay, it just adds a little bit of darkness back there so that the text is now a little bit more readable, which is exactly what we want. Now, another thing you can do is if you really want it to blend in with the background is you can set both colors at dark and then experiment with a blend mode like soft light. Depending on the image in the background, it could certainly help, and it does for the most part, right? It helps, but sometimes it's better to just set your own colors so that you have a little bit more control over how that looks back there, right? And I might want to pull this down a touch, just like that. All right. Let's change this to Neon Rider. All right, maybe I'll make that a little bit larger. Let's go 100, why not, right? And then maybe, wonder what this would look like. Overlay or soft light. It's pushing it a little bit. Want to make sure that things are, readable across the entire experience. Might be pushing it, but because we have that overlay back there, it possibly works. Probably doesn't, but we're going to leave it at that for now. And then we may also want our user. So I'm going to hop over to Finder and let's go ahead and grab maybe this image over here. Boop, pop it in there. And I'll make this nice and large. And then one thing I'm noticing is even though I have that overlay in the background, right? The user profile picture blends in just a little bit with that image back there. And certainly depending on what image we end up replacing, it could blend in even more. So I'm going to select this particular image and let's go ahead and add a border. I'm going to place a border on the outside, which is the second option here. Maybe I'll sample this background color that I'm using and then really increase the size of this border. Let's try about 10. So it just adds a little bit of it almost looks like a cutout in the featured image in the background, but it really kind of removes that fear of adding another image back there so that it, blends, because we definitely don't want things to blend in. So I think this could work. All right, that looks pretty good. And then we can go ahead and start populating the gallery down here at the bottom. Now, 2 of these rows we used repeat grid, so we can just select a bunch of images and pop them on in there. And in that case, I'm going to select this one, and maybe, where are the trees? Do I have the trees here? Here, trees. Boop, just like that. And then down to the bottom, we may want a few more. That one looks fun. Maybe that one, and boop. And then we might want one featured image going across this section here. So let's grab this one and then maybe resize it. That could work. Now, one other thing that I'm noticing is a lot of these images have very dark spots. On the edges here, it's pretty dark. On the edges on this one, it basically blends in with the background, which we may not necessarily want. So in this case, what we can do is we can add a very subtle border around these images. So if I activate a border, set it to white, and then drop the opacity somewhere around 10, right? It just kind of pops that image just a little bit. And you can definitely experiment with the opacity value of that border. But I think that could work. And inside the repeat grid, we only have to do it once, which is great. Oh, once for each one. All right, that could work. All right, so things are looking pretty good, right? We have our featured image at the top, we have our featured information, we have our user right down here in the middle, and then we have our gallery. Now, one other thing that we may want is we may want the ability to hover over top of these images and see additional information. So we're going to go ahead and create a hover state. And what we're going to do is we're not going to create a component out of the image. We're actually going to create a separate component that lives on top of it that's going to help us activate the hover state. So I can make that, it's pretty simple, but oops, put that away. So I can make that simple by duplicating the current image, and then let's change the color to, let's change it to black, and then we're going to drop the opacity. Actually, what we can do is maybe we can actually also use a gradient, very similar to what we did for the overlay up there. Drop that to 0, make this a little bit darker. Maybe we'll add a little bit of color in here. Maybe we'll drop this a little bit. Something like that. We just want this darker section at the bottom so that we can display some key information very similar to what we have at the top. Now in this case, what we might want is, let's say the user, so or maybe Cyberpunk Living. And even though this is a title, we probably don't want to use the Wayfinder typeface, mainly because it's going to be very small, right? We might go up to, I don't know, let's say 28 at the max. But if we launch the preview, it's a little bit difficult to see, right? So we're going to switch back to Adobe Clean, and maybe we'll do extra bold here. And down below, we're going to put Laura's name. There we go. And I'm going to probably drop the size. Again, this is secondary information, so we're definitely going to drop it a little bit. Just like that. And then over here to the right, we're going to have some additional information, you know, the likes, comments, that sort of fun stuff. Again, just pretend at the moment that there is an icon inside of this area. And duplicate that. Of course, you can use a repeat grid, you can use a stack, you can use all sorts of different things. There we go. This might be a little bit too, it's not too bad. I think it'll work. It might be, I don't know. Is it too big? It might be too big. Let me pop this into a stack. And then let's make this a bit smaller. Oh, I forgot to turn the stack on. That helps, right? Maybe it's the icon that's too big. That could be it. Let's make that a little bit smaller as well. Alrighty. We're going to leave this for now. We can always definitely go back and make some changes to this particular element, but oops. I think I enabled stack on the wrong thing. That's why it wasn't working. Well done. Well done, Howard. So Sana is asking, what's the best option to choose, stack over repeat grid? So it really depends. I mean, a stack, one thing I like about stacks is that, you know, you can put components in there and it won't display all the components if you change states across the repeat grid. You can also rearrange things really nicely and easily using a stack, whereas repeat grids you can't. Like if I wanted this image here at the beginning of this repeat grid, I would have to manually pop that image in and then move that one over, but a stack you just drag and drop, which is super nice. So there are definitely advantages and disadvantages of both. All right, so now this is going to be the overlay, which is going to display when a hover takes place. So what we're going to do is we're going to select all this information here, right? All these layers, and we're going to create a component. So Command and Control K or within the Properties Inspector again. Now, what you're noticing is that when I created this component, even though this is the first time I created it, it's an instance. And that's because we have our component inside of a repeat grid. Placing a main component in a repeat grid is just asking for trouble. We had that many moons ago. It was very confusing at times. So anytime you put a component in a repeat grid, it's going to be an instance. So we want to make sure to edit that main component. And if you want to make your life a little bit easier, you can kind of move this over top of it like that, right? And then what we want is on this default state, we don't want any of the information to be seen. So inside of here, inside the component, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all this information, drop the opacity down to 0, like that. And then we want to go ahead and create a hover state. What's nice about hover states is they're automatically wired up, as you can tell by the lightning icon to the right. So it's going to automatically wire up state 1 to state 2 and state 2 back to state 1. All right. Now I'm going to dive in here, bump the opacity back up to 100%. And now we have our hover state, right? Now you're going to notice that by default, the hover states are wired up with auto animate. So there is, a little bit of a delay. It's a little bit of a fade, which in this case, we don't really need or want. So that's one situation where even though a hover state is wired up by default, I'm going to go into prototype mode and it's automatically selected. I'm just going to switch the type from auto animate to transition and then make sure that animation is set to none. So we don't have that fade, right? So now if I preview one more time, you're going to notice it's nice and simple, right? Nice and fast, which is great. And of course, we can do the exact same thing for this section down here and all these different, areas. But we're going to move on to, let's go ahead and move on to, maybe we want when, this particular project is clicked on, we might want to navigate to another page that shows more details about it. Or maybe even it might be an overlay, right? So I'm going to create one more artboard, which is going to be another 1920 by 1080. Where are my web presets? They are here somewhere. Boop, there we go. And on this one, we're going to, have the same background color. So I'm just going to go ahead and sample it. But what we want here is we want to be able to display not just Alexander saying hover state should be 65% opaque. It depends. It doesn't necessarily have to be. Depends. A lot of times it depends on what's behind there. There's no magical number. It doesn't have to be 65% or 75%. It's really about what works well for your project. If it's a very light project, then you might want to go a little bit higher. If it's a very dark project, it might be okay, a little bit lower. All right, so here we're going to want to display the project details. So I'm going to go ahead and draw out just like this. I'll round out the corners just a little bit. I don't want to go too much. Probably don't want to go 16 like I did on the previews because I want the whole image to really be displayed nicely. And I'm leaving a little bit of room on this side so we can have possibly comments or a place to, like, appreciate, whatever it might be, right? And I'm also going to leave a little bit of room at the bottom so that if there are additional images down below, then you'll be able to scroll down there. Philip is asking, can this export code? So XD does provide CSS and SVG code, but we also have a ton of plugins inside of the Discover Plugins or Browse Plugins section that allow you to export HTML, CSS, all sorts of. There's also a Flutter plugin. There's all sorts of different things. So definitely check out some of the. Oh, Alexander says, I mean, it would fit the 80s. Oh, I got it. Aha, that makes sense. Okay, he was talking about this specific project. That makes sense now. All right, so let's go ahead and hop back over to here and boop, pump that image in. I'm also going to give a little bit of a border like I did in the preview just so it separates it a little bit from the background. And then over here to the right, we're going to probably block this in. It's not going to be too detailed. This is going to be for the comments. So this might be a darker section like this. Maybe I'll round out the corners like I did for the image. Add a bit of a border. And then in here, actually this might be a little bit darker, but there might be a few different sections, right? At the top, I'm going to duplicate this, move this up. There might be a bit of a header, and I'll unround out those corners, holding down Alt or Option and pulling them back. Now this section might be a little bit lighter, but the actual comments section, which is going to be here, might be a bit darker, right? And then down at the bottom, we might also have another block. This one might be a bit bigger because this is where you're going to actually leave a comment. There might be a, a big text block or a button of some sort. So we might have something like that. There we go. Just so that users know exactly what this section is. And then there might be a few different icons. Maybe there'll be a little chevron over here to the left that allows you to actually collapse this so that if you want to see the image full width or you don't want to see the feedback, comments, or whatever it might be, you'll be able to very easily just hide it. So we'll have a little bit of an arrow there. Bump it up in size and thickness a little bit. Is that too much? It's not too bad, actually. And then maybe we'll have two of them right in the center. Might be too big, but we'll run with it. We'll see. And then over here to the right, we may want the user's profile again, because there's a possibility that this page is deep linked. So, if someone lands on this particular project, they might want to follow this user directly from here. So to make that a little bit easier, I'm going to grab the photo that I have here, copy it, and then right-click and then paste appearance. Now I don't need the border in this case, so I'm going to drop it down, or going to turn it off completely. May want to add a little bit of a border around it just so that it does separate it from the background, but we may also want a simple follow button. I don't know why I activated the grid to make a straight line, but sure. Is that too big? Yeah, it's not too bad actually. But this, that'll do. Yeah. It's not the greatest looking thing in the world, but it will do for now. And then finally, inside of here, we may want, to display a few different comments that may have already come in. So this will be one user here. And then we're going to speed through this because we are running out of time. This will be the user's name, which I'll keep at bold. And then right down below, maybe we'll do regular, and this will be the feedback goes here. That might be a bit too big. I want to make sure that we have a nice amount of space for these comments, because some of them might be one line, some of them might be two lines. So what we can do is we actually set a fixed width. Let's extend it out to here. And then if I select all of this, I'm going to group it, user. Now this is another advantage, going back to the question earlier, this is another advantage of using a stack over a repeat grid. If you did have items that some would be larger than others, this is what you're going to want. So if I place this one user comment into a group, I'll call this users. I'm going to turn a stack on, define it as vertical, and then if I duplicate a few more, right, and I spread these out just a little bit, and then I dive into this second one here, right? This photo is absolutely, did I spell that right? I don't know. Amazing. Please take more and post. So do you notice what happened, right? Maybe I'll sign it. So because we have a stack on the overall group, it automatically pushed the users down below, which is exactly what we want. So we don't have to go through and manually move things around and make sure everything line up. Everything just does it automatically for you, which is amazing. All right. Alexander saying you can add Lottie that simulates like an audio waveform as a circle. Yeah, so I think in one of my, was it the music player possibly? I added basically just that. And yeah, those Lottie animations really go a long way. I actually posted on Dribbble, I think it was, yesterday. It was a financial screen, and there's just a very subtle Lottie animation that just highlights the active indicator, and it just adds this really nice touch to your designs. It's quite nice. And I love the fact that Lottie is native in XD, which is amazing. All right. We're going to add a very simple text box here before we wire this up as an overlay very quickly. Round this out a little bit, and then we'll add a very simple button, mostly placeholder because we are running out of time. And what I should be doing is actually saving a lot of these colors and character styles to my assets. But we'll just pretend that I did that properly, right? All right, this will do. Didn't complete all of it, but what we might want now is to actually display this as an overlay instead of a separate page. So, what we can do here is go to prototype mode, select this particular image here, and then drag this handle over to this artboard. And then within the properties inspector, we want tap as the trigger, but we want overlay as the action, the type right over here, right? This will allow us to move this around if the size of the artboard was smaller. In this case, it's the same size, so we can't move it around. But when we press play, we're going to notice a problem, but do this on purpose. When we press play and click, it's going to display the overlay, the contents of that other artboard on this artboard, and we can just click to turn off. Now, what you're going to notice is that we can still see a lot of the information in the background, which we may or may not want, depending on the design and the project and all, so on and so forth. In this case, we probably don't. We want it to kind of black out. So what we would do is back on this artboard here, I'm simply going to grab a rectangle, draw one out like that. I'll change the color to black and then just drop the opacity maybe to 95%, right? So now if I scroll down, right, we have our overlay and then click. Now we have a nice overlay in the background that allows us to see just a little bit behind it. Not everything, but a little bit. But if we wanted to, we can always maybe drop this to 90 so we can see a little bit more. That looks pretty good. Now, some of you might be wondering, what about a background blur? Can we just add a background blur behind there? And you certainly can. But when you start adding background blurs, we already have a background blur on this navigation bar, but when we start adding background blurs that are this large, there's the tendency that things start to slow down, not necessarily in XD, but when you develop it on the actual web, background blurs can be kind of intensive. But just to kind of show you what that looks like. Now, of course, we don't have the information behind this to see what it looks like on this artboard, but if I blur it, drop this down to maybe -20, bump this up to let's say 80, right? Can't see it just yet. Let's tweak it a little bit. Let's bring this down. There we go. So you can kind of start to see some of the information behind this overlay back here. It looks okay, but there's also a lot of colors back there. So it's bleeding those colors in, which in some cases might work. But in this case, we really want to focus on this main image here. And using a background blur, I think, is just going to bring us away from that image. So something like just a simple 90% black box could do the trick, right? All right. That is going to wrap things up for me for today. A big thank you to everyone who has tuned in. Afrosia and Umacorn and Wade and Cornell, Chris, Senna, Steve, Alexander. Great to see all of you. Kyle T. Webster is coming up in just a few moments. I will be back next week with another masterclass, and I'll see you all then. Thanks, everyone.